Welcome to the latest webinar in the CASCADE series on knowledge exchange evaluation. Can you nip to the next slide? Do I have the ability to do that?
You can just ask me when you want it.
Excellent. So for those of you who haven't come along to a CASCADE seminar before, the CASCADE is a network of academic institutions in the UK, higher education institutions and research institutions working to find sustainable and socially just solutions to the biodiversity crisis. So we're a broad mix of institutions, but crucially also disciplines in the academic and the staff involved in it. And we're here to kind of leverage the best of the knowledge that is produced and exchanged within UK academic institutions around biodiversity. If you want to be part of the network and you're not already involved, do contact us. We have a website, and Hannah is our project manager for that. Next slide, please. And oh, excellent. And this is a map of everyone involved. If you don't see your research institution represented there, you can by all means become affiliated by contacting Hannah. Next slide. The work that we've done is really responding to this idea that there's a gap in knowledge exchange between biodiversity professionals, academia and government, particularly a lack of coordination, and the idea that knowledge might be produced, but it's not necessarily having the effect that it could and should have. So we're looking to develop our science policy bridge between different organizations. Next slide. So this is so we started off with a Research England funded 2-year pilot project, which is really to prove that or to test whether our approach can work, to understand what knowledge exchange capability exists within UK academic institutions, both amongst people who are more research focused and of course professional services staff who are more knowledge exchange focused, and to understand the demand for it. And to build this network that could become almost like a one-stop shop for people who might want to use biodiversity data. And within our pilot project, we chose to work quite closely with the CBD Secretariat and JNCC. We could to kind of really show that we could do this through contributing to the global biodiversity framework, both with regards to the UK's contribution and more global questions. So we chose to focus on that, on the GBF, as our kind of focus for our test pilot, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the limit to our ambitions. Next slide. Which brings us to our today's agenda. I'm pleased to say that we've got 2 excellent speakers who are going to talk about how we can do knowledge exchange evaluation within our work, the collective work that exists within UK higher academic institutions. Our first one is Laura Meagher. So Laura is Principal of the Technology Development Group, a Fellow of the University of Edinburgh and the James Hutton Institute, which is in Aberdeenshire, and an Associate at the Research Unit for Research Utilisation at the University of St Andrews. So Laura has spent over 30 years working in the US and the UK with research and educational institutions, along with industry and government, focusing on the facilitation and evaluation of strategic change. And Laura has developed frameworks to evaluate the impacts of research on policy and practice. So we're first going to hear from Laura, and then we're going to hear from Kathryn Oliver, who's Professor of Evidence and Policy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Kathryn is interested in how we make and mobilise and use evidence in policy and practice. She co-directs the research collaboration Transforming Evidence, which brings together funders, decision makers, practitioners, and researchers from a range of disciplines and sectors with the goal of ensuring that research is used in practice. Kathryn is a former fellow in the UK Government Office for Science, exploring how evidence knowledge needs are articulated and acted on by central government, and is currently an NIHR, National Institute for Health Research, Programme Director for the Policy Research Programme. So they're going to tell us a little bit about their experience and insights into knowledge exchange evaluation. And then we're going to open it up for questions. And if you do have questions, drop them into the chat. I'll hand over now to Laura.
Okay, am I on now? Good. It's very good to be here with you all. I think Cascade is an ambitious program striving to do a great many of the things I believe in. So it's nice to be part of this conversation today. I guess I just ask you for the next slide, please, Hannah. Just a little bit about me. My PhD is in evolution, and I've all through my professional life been interested in processes of change and complexity. And I designed, catalyzed, and led a lot of novel initiatives, strategic alliances across disciplines, institutions, and sectors. And in the last umpty-up years, I've done a lot of evaluations for different funders, especially in the UK. And usually people are looking for some kind of non-academic impacts from research programs and schemes. So I've developed some experience in that, and I sometimes play a critical friend role. So I help complicated long-term programs with their formative evaluation and their critical reflection. So that's a little bit about me. And the next slide, please. So this is these are spoilers. If you just pay attention to this slide, you can zone out until Kathryn's talk, of course. But this is what I'll be talking about. I'll be saying that a range of different types of impacts exist. It can be helpful to see that. Impacts arise through processes, and that's including, of course, crucially, knowledge exchange and engagement with different stakeholders. And I'll talk a little bit about how impacts develop over time. And that means that impacts and their indicators can be captured over time so that compelling narratives can be told. And I'd also point out that formative evaluation, real-time self-reflection, can improve efforts in real time. So that's what I'll be talking about very quickly. Zip, zip, zip. Next slide, please, Anna. Why do we bother to generate impacts through knowledge exchange and so on? And why do we bother to evaluate them? As we all know, there are converging pressures for evidence-based policy or practice. Funders of research want to tell government that research makes a difference outside of academia. Organizations want to tell funders that their research makes a difference outside of academia. But I think for probably many of you, there's also a personal motivation of individual researchers wanting to make a difference. And the next slide. Now that's all those are motivations, but impact identification is famously hard to do, even for impact evaluation geeks like me. There are a lot of subtleties and complex processes involved. Impacts are often diffuse or intangible. They may develop over quite a long-term time frame, making attribution of causality or contribution quite difficult. So there are challenges, but I submit if ongoing generation and evidencing of diverse types of impacts recognize the importance of dynamic processes that develop over time, not just outputs, impacts can be evidenced more compellingly, and processes can be analyzed and improved in real time to continuously enhance likelihood of future impacts. So that's the approach I recommend. And the next slide, please. First, I'll talk about what may be quite liberating for some people is a range of types of impacts. So I did some of the first impact evaluations for the Research Council starting in 2007. And so they'd wheel me in at the end of a program. And I would find, I'll go through these, the first three classic types of impacts, but I was also finding process-based impacts. So I'll just go through those briefly. Instrumental impacts, that's everybody wants to see a direct impact of research on policy, a new piece of legislation or practice, farmers behaving in a new way, or inventing a new widget that makes lots of money. Instrumental impacts are great, but they don't always come about and they can take a long time. Less tangible but very important are conceptual impacts, changes in ways of thinking or understanding, juxtaposing ideas. Whoa, I never realized climate change mattered to something. Capacity building of all sorts. Those are classic types of impacts. But then process-based impacts that I also think are worth capturing and being aware of are attitude change or culture change, where researchers or stakeholders or institutions become more positive towards the process of knowledge exchange. They find that knowledge exchange is valuable. And enduring connectivity is when an individual researcher and an individual stakeholder maintain a connection beyond the life of a project. They keep in touch, they talk to each other. clearly internalizing research findings from the stakeholder, knowledges and questions of the stakeholder for the researcher, so that in the longer term, they're laying the groundwork for impact. So those are 5 types that you may find useful to think about. Next slide, please. It also can be useful to have some sort of conceptual framework. This happens to be mine, so I like it, but there are a lot of them out there. And the idea is to have a way that helps you think about knowledge flowing. So in this particular one, you see that the 3 points, arrows between policymakers, practitioners, and stakeholders and researchers go 2 ways because everybody has different knowledge. Knowledge exchange needs to be 2-way. Policymakers, practitioners, and researchers, as you all know, are all diverse. So there's a lot of variety in the system. And then the third thing I'd point out is those little sort of horizontal ovals below the center of the page. And those are knowledge intermediaries. So they're sometimes very interesting individuals or organizations that are knowledge intermediaries because they translate comfortably back and forth between stakeholders and researchers. And they can play a surprisingly important role. So just have some sense of knowledge flowing, I think is helpful. And the next slide. And I think it's very important to think about impacts being generated through processes, many of which are really based on human interaction, like genuine 2-way dialogue, sharing of questions, open sharing of questions and needs and plans, thinking about key factors, maybe integration across disciplines, employing key roles, like maybe encouraging knowledge intermediaries to be involved. But a lot of it comes down to building relationships with mutual respect. And the next slide, please. This is just one example of that. My colleague Ursula Martin and I looked at how mathematicians generate impacts. And we did that a while ago, comparing and contrasting with then the 2014 REF, which had first asked for impact case studies. It's a bit better now, but then there was this sort of idea that a paper would be published in a mainstream journal, there would be a straight line to some change in the outside world, which is possibly not how it happens. So we analyzed the different impact case studies that were submitted, but we found something quite different when we actually talked to, interviewed or surveyed heads of maths departments. And over 2/3 of them said informal relationships, relationships that build on other relationships, were the key to making an impact. So it's that human side of things, long-term relationships building over time, often quite informal, that really made a difference. And they were barely were mentioned in the official impact case studies. So that was an interesting finding. Next slide, please. So shifting a little bit to talking about evaluation, or lots of numbers and analyses, I've done them, can be done, but really often what packs a punch are the impact stories, impact narratives. So how can those be developed over time? Well, for one thing, it's useful in reporting to funders, sometimes necessary, but also impact story can help you communicate with current stakeholders or prospective stakeholders about how it all works, might help with future proposals. It might just be satisfying as a legacy captured in a story, and which might help in mentoring others. So an impact story or an impact narrative will be more compelling if the processes and the steps, which you can think of as interim impacts, impacts in progress, indicators of progress towards impacts, are captured all along the way. Paying attention to the middle of the story can lead to really well-crafted and convincing impact narratives later, say when the project is over. And that will add credibility to any claims of causality or contribution if you've been capturing data along the way. And also, if when you're in the middle of your own story, when you're in the midst, if you think about it and how it's going on your hoped journey towards impacts, it can help inform any mid-course tactics you might want to take or change so that you're evolving and continuously enhancing the likelihood of future impacts. So on the next slide, please. I told you I'd zip along. My colleague, David Edwards at Forest Research, and I were thinking about how to try to pull together a way to help people come up with their own evaluative impact stories. So we said, well, first of all, the core impact evaluation questions are impacts, who or what changed, in what ways, how do we know? It's also probably important to think about the causes of impact. Why did the changes occur? How did the changes occur? What were the factors or contributing processes that actually caused impact? And then it's always important, I think, to go through critical reflection. What lessons can we learn? When I evaluate programs, I talk to people, and I say, well, you've been involved in something complicated. Surely you've learned some lessons. And often it's very rich if people have a chance to step back and reflect. So what lessons can be learned, and what should we do next? So those are core impact evaluation questions. And then in the next slide, please, we came up with a framework. This is published, as you can see, and also in various blogs and things, but we tried to have in one page a useful framework for research impact evaluation. And the core evaluation questions that I just talked about, the 5 types of impacts that I always talk about, different types of stakeholders, policymakers, practitioners, communities, whatever, those can vary, and how we know what the evidence is. And then 8 different categories of causes of impact. I'll show you those in a larger screen next. But basically, we tested this framework against a dozen very different case studies of research and potential impact within the agency, Forest Research. And we found that this covered everything. And people in other sectors have made use of this framework. And it does seem to be a convenient way to structure thinking and looking at how to talk about impacts and how they've come about. In the next slide, just to show you the different categories of causes of impacts. These are 8 categories: problem framing, have stakeholders been involved, for example, research management, maybe there's a push to integrate across disciplines, inputs like money or others, outputs, dissemination, engagement, what are the tactics, how's it worked, who are the users, have they been particularly proactive, have there been key knowledge champions or intermediaries? And so those are all causes of impacts. And then there's the 8th one, which is you can't do anything about it. Political winds change, or fire takes over your forest research site, whatever it might be. There will be causes that facilitate or hinder impact. But if you think about these 8 categories, it helps to understand how impacts have come about. So the next slide, please. We at one meeting we went to, we tried to make this quite visual, and it was kind of cute because we tested it in forest research. So we put everything in pieces of wood, but we said these are building blocks. So all those elements that I talked about in the framework, 5 types of impacts, several different types of stakeholders, 8 categories, which everything can be subdivided, but 8 categories of causes. If you think of those as building blocks, every project, every program can put those building blocks together in a different way, can subdivide them, can name them, can put them together. Every project will have a unique impact story. So we hope that by providing these building blocks, this framework for thinking about it, we can stimulate, say, a research team to think, well, how can we tell our story, our unique impact story with these building blocks? And the next slide, please. So I have this picture. The aim in evidencing impact is to be able to tell a story, which should be a true story. But by drawing the different players together, creating genuine relationships, you can enhance the probability of impacts that will unfold over time, sometimes a long time, and make it easier to capture evidence along the way so that in the future, you can tell a compelling impact story. So I think my last slide is coming up here. Next slide, please. So key takeaways, maybe I have 2. There are multiple types of impacts. I've had people just thank me, department heads of math, a lot of other people just thank me for reassuring them that different types of impacts count and are important. Impacts arise dynamically through processes that they develop through. If you see something as a process, you can analyze it. If you analyze it, you can learn about it and you can keep improving it. So I think that's helpful. Engagement of stakeholders is absolutely critical. Remember that impacts arise and develop over time, so that if you're thinking ahead about the impacts you're aiming for, you can have your antennae out for early indicators of progress or not towards that. You can watch out for them, learn from them, build upon those early indicators. And being able to articulate impacts and lessons learned, I think critical reflection, and share those will be useful in a variety of ways. So my very last slide is, next slide, please, is just to say again, understanding of processes can aid those interwoven goals, both generation of impacts and evaluation of impacts. And that's me.
Thank you very much. And without further ado, we will hand over to Kathryn Oliver.
Hi, hello everybody. Lovely to be here. I very much support what Laura has been talking about, and I hope that what I'm going to say builds on quite nicely. When you appreciate that impact is such a complex beast, it's not an outcome, it's not a process of itself, but it's a combination of interlocking organizations and factors. The idea that you might be able to control it or intervene to improve it in some way becomes quite overwhelming. I have to say, that's how I often feel. I feel, how can you possibly take control of this very complex set of often chaotic factors? But that's not necessarily the feeling that is shared by many people. If you want to move on to the next slide. What I've been looking at for the past 6 or 7 years is knowledge exchange activities that are undertaken and try to understand what we're doing, why we're doing, and how we're doing it. And in general, what we've observed is a massive growth in knowledge exchange initiatives. So we map these. You can go and look online at the publication that we've got associated with this. We've got some fun visuals somewhere as well, where you can see that many knowledge exchange activities have been going on for decades, if not centuries. The very earliest ones we looked at were the very early learner societies, things like the Royal Society that's been going since 1500s. But the main uptick in knowledge exchange activities has occurred since the mid-1990s, and it's been very largely driven by universities. Certainly in the UK, that's the case. And actually what we're seeing is more and more and more activity, more people trying to intervene in this increasingly very busy space without necessarily that sense of overwhelm that I think might be a good guide to mindful engagement in this space. So next slide, please. We mapped all the organisations in the UK who were undertaking what they were described as academic policy engagement. We also looked at a representative sample of international funders and any initiatives or activities which were connected in some way with the UK. So this is quite a global snapshot. What we did was we categorised them by what they were trying to do. So we found that they fell into these 9 categories. So, for example, disseminating, communicating research, things in this bucket with stuff like newsletters or roundtables where policymakers were invited to hear more about research projects that have been going on. Formal institutional requests for evidence, that will be things like requests for consultations put out by government, sort of those formal pull mechanisms, if you like. And then in the middle, you've got these 3 sets of skills, which are 3 sets of activities, which are about building decision makers' skills. So often this is courses offered to, for example, government officials on research methods so that they can better understand research, build their research literacy. There's some offer for researchers as well in trying to increase their impact. A lot of it is very focused on what you can do as an individual or what your project can do to sort of increase its volume, increase its impact or your impact on your policy audiences. And then there's quite a lot at the moment, particularly around building what I like to think of as being professional friendships. So these are people with whom you recognise you're going to have a long-term relationship, you're on the same team. And it's not just an opportunity to get to know each other, but to actually build some long-term collaborations and work programs. In the last 3 sets of activities, with what we think of as being more systemic. So overall, they fall into what we think of as 3 generations of thinking around evidence use. So a very linear model, push-pull, very relational. It's all to do with people and around relationships, and then this sort of systemic way of thinking about impact, which really recognizes that we're all working in different organizations. There's no one coordinating place, but actually, in order to bring opportunities together, work streams together, the correct workforce with the correct skills at the right time, is going to take coordinated effort and distributed leadership. So what does that look like in terms of knowledge exchange initiatives? Things like strategic leadership, so people advocating for evidence-informed policymaking, for example. So the Alliance for Useful Evidence, some of you might remember that, used to do that, but the leadership of things like the What Work Centres and so on would do that and provide that sort of impetus. There's quite a few prizes out there now who reward researchers for impact. Again, it's mostly at the individual, possibly the team level. And then there's a bit of activity around sort of creating infrastructure in post. But as you can see, most of the initiatives are still very much in the push-pull space and increasingly in the relational space. There isn't that much activity thinking about systemic interventions comparatively. Next slide, please. However, of these 1,922 initiatives which we found, and this was in 2019, so it will probably almost have doubled by now, only 3% had a publicly available evaluation, which meant that although there's been a huge growth in initiatives, there's actually very little learning being shared about how we're doing knowledge exchange and what effect it's having. And I think that's a real problem, not just because that means that we're working blind and everybody's starting from scratch, probably duplicating effort, relearning things that we already know the answer to, but I think also it's got big implications for public accountability as well. Why are we doing what we're doing and to what effect? Next slide, please. So for me, there's a question about, are we doing more harm than good? Often there's an assumption that more knowledge exchange is just a good thing. I'm not sure that's always the case, particularly if what we're doing is taking up more and more policymakers' time, which is a very precious resource. Often these knowledge exchange activities that we found were not being based on a really good understanding of what policy looks like, i.e. often very reactive, very quick turnaround times, having to bring together lots of different forms of knowledge. They were really based much more around, I've done some great research and I'd like you to hear about it. The training and advice that we offer our early career researchers often tends to be based on the experience of quite unusual academics who've had an unusual set of circumstances and experiences themselves. My feeling is that without clear goals around our knowledge exchange activities and funding, we can do a bit more harm than good, not just around wasting people's time and resources, but also around making it difficult for the people who come after us. If we go and do some policy engagement and the people on the other side of the table have a terrible experience or an unpleasant experience or just a useless experience, the next people who come and try and set up something will find it that much harder. The other thing we find generally in knowledge exchange is people who've done it before tend to find it easier to make the most of opportunity. So actually, we do see a lot of inequities in who gets the opportunity to do knowledge exchange and what that means for the knowledge that's available to policymakers. Next slide, please. And of course, just to flag, the engagement has got costs as well as benefits. There's often a narrative that more is better, but as I said, it takes a lot of what's invisible work. Often that work is given to people who aren't necessarily academic researchers, but to professional support staff. And so it's sort of not counted in the evaluations that we do. And there's lots of interpersonal costs because it's interpersonal work. And again, that tends not to be counted in typical evaluations. So it's sort of experiences being stress or burnout or conflict, reduced motivation and so on. And those sorts of things really affect people's experiences and the effectiveness of any knowledge exchange that we do. Next slide, please. However, one thing we have seen is this shift overall. So although we know broadly that you need linear models and you need the relational element, it's much, much harder to bring those together within a systemic way of thinking, although I do think Cascade is doing fantastic work thinking about how that might work in practice. Next slide, please. So the key question for me that I think we all need to wrestle with, and this is where evaluation can help us, is what exactly is it we're trying to achieve with our knowledge exchange initiative? So typically what we see is we know how to do one thing. When I say we, I mean we as a funder or we as an academic, we as a university, and we keep doing that. So we're really good at running roundtables, so we keep offering roundtables, or we really like fellowships, so we keep funding fellowships. But what we don't think about is what is the knowledge exchange goal? What is the impact that we would like to see? What is the observable change that we want to arise from our activities? So, for example, we might think that a particular government department is engaging with a very selective group of experts, and we would like them to increase the diversity of their network so they have access to a broader range of knowledge. That's a very different goal than we want to deliver a specific piece of advice to solve a specific problem, or we think that there's just not enough evidence in one place, so we need to mature the evidence base and we need some engagement around that. These are very different goals. They're all completely legitimate. I'm not in any way suggesting that one is more important than the other. But what we need to do at the outset of a knowledge exchange piece of work is understand what the goal is that we're trying to achieve, and then to unpick the appropriate mechanism to achieve that goal. And trying to understand the links between those is where I think evaluation can be really super helpful. This is just a list of all the different mechanisms that I found so far that government departments use to do their engagement. Next slide, please. So this is a good example of how that might work in practice. We might have a hypothesis that the reason that policymakers aren't drawing on our research is because they don't have research skills. and therefore we might offer some training capacity building around research methods. And then what we would need to do would be to evaluate the change in research use, not just to keep offering the same course, but to actually see, is it helping us address the goal that we have identified? Next slide, please. Oh, that was the end. So yes, my take-home message for you, I suppose, is we all have choices about how we do this. A long while ago, there was a really great blog written by a Dane, actually, who said that as researchers or as professionals, knowledge exchange professionals, we have a choice, and often we're not very good about talking about what these choices are within universities around how we do this. We might see it as part of our job, we might see it as an add-on to something we have to do. But we have options. So you can do what he calls leave a cultural dent. So not seek to make, have a big impact and, go away and say, oh, you should go and talk to Kathryn. She was fantastic. More, you've changed the general tone of the conversation. Or you can be what you might think of being a sort of heroic scientist going out and speaking truth to power, or a sort of social activist with a specific policy in mind that you think needs to be changed. Or my preferred metaphor, being a humble gardener, where you go and you see a few things that you can tweak and change. The key thing about the knowledge exchange world is that at the moment we're not very good about having those conversations about what those different models might look like and how they translate into our work in practice. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, both. Thank you for your knowledge exchange activity on how to do knowledge exchange. Yeah, that was fascinating. So I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask a few questions. And I guess the first is that these models and frameworks are super interesting and very helpful. But what's the most important actions that people can take to integrate good knowledge exchange into their research, into the whole kind of life cycle of a piece of research, bearing in mind the kind of other demands that we have in our time and attention? Laura, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I think it probably picks up on Kathryn's key point about thinking ahead. I think if researchers can think ahead, and I advise people on this, to the types of impacts that they want, and sometimes I work with marine researchers, they'll say, we want a clean ocean. I said, well, that's wonderful. Let's back that up. What's a more specific kind of impact that you might be able to contribute to? And then if researchers think about that, something that's possibly a bit within their control, then early on to back down from that, what would be effective ways of getting to that impact? And what would be, so they could think about which type of mechanism is right for knowledge exchange or whatever. And also, so they can have their antennae out for indicators that they are or are not progressing towards that desired impact, so that they see impacts developing over time. Researchers know you get new data, you can, you might have to interpret things differently, but you have a sense of where you're going, try to figure out the best way to get there, critically reflect periodically throughout the course of your research, so that you fine-tune what you're doing so that it does advance towards a particular impact. And that might be having your team get together, working with an enlightened knowledge exchange professional. It might ideally be having a couple of stakeholders there that maybe are knowledge intermediaries or potential champions, so they can help you think about that from the very beginning.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The other thing I would say is try and be as realistic as possible about what you think your knowledge exchange goals might be. Again, this is something universities are not always terribly helpful at helping us be realistic about it. We're encouraged to be ambitious, and we're encouraged to be very wide-ranging and imaginative in what we say we're going to achieve with our projects. But the truth is, a realistic knowledge exchange impact might be, I've had a conversation with someone in DEFRA. And, if that is honestly as far as you can get with the project that you're doing, that's absolutely fine. I don't think, that's, for me, it's just silly to say, oh, I'm going to have an impact on the white paper that's coming out. That's obviously completely off the table. Be realistic about what you can achieve.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to follow up with that with another one, perhaps, which is we, within our network, obviously we've got academics more focused on the research side of thing, and professionals more focused on with expertise and knowledge exchange. And it's really about how do we go about deciding what's the best way to go about deciding the relationship between those sort of, if you want to think of it as two parts of the equation. So how do we decide who leads on knowledge exchange, and if you've got any insights into sort of how best to work in partnership between the knowledge exchange professionals and the researchers?
You want to start that one, Kathryn?
Sure. I feel like I'm being very down on academics at the moment. We're not always the best at saying, actually, I don't know, and we should ask somebody else. Again, I think it comes down to what we think realistically you need to do, recognizing that you're a team and everybody's got different strengths and experiences. So if it's about running a facilitated task and finish process, probably the academics aren't going to be the best people to do it. On the other hand, if what you need is someone to go and make some points in front of a select committee, you probably do want your prof up there doing that. And then it's about how can you prepare and support her to do that as effectively as possible. It's probably not a very good answer.
Well, and I think for now, I remember, long ago, after I was doing some of those early impact evaluations, I went to, I guess, I forget the name of it now, but it was the first national meeting of kind of knowledge exchange professionals, and they thought of themselves as knowledge intermediaries. And they had, before this growth in the industry that Kathryn's talked about, they all each individually felt kind of alone in their own university. So it's sort of a support group situation. But I think what became clear was that there are some knowledge exchange professionals who are quite aware of the kind of variety of types of impacts, the variety of steps that need to be taken, the variety of types of stakeholders. And those are the ones to work with. I think there are people, and there are, just as there are different kinds of academics, there are different kinds of knowledge exchange professionals who might think that mostly what they're for is to get a piece of tech patented and out into the world. And so you do need to find, just as researchers and stakeholders kind of need to have some bit of spark if they're going to keep working together, finding a knowledge exchange professional that can work with you as you feel comfortable is important. I remember this was for that mathematics impact. I had a great quote from a key stakeholder who used a lot of math research, but they said, just throwing a question over the wall and getting the answer thrown back does not do it for me. You wanted to have deeper questions and deeper conversations. And so you will probably want it, if for that kind of situation, a knowledge exchange professional who can facilitate, take the hassle off, but respect that kind of conversation needs to take place.
Excellent. If you've got a question, do pop it in the chat, and then I will come to you. And if you could, I'll ask you to unmute and ask it yourself, or rather than me mangle your question by reading it out. Before we do that, just quickly, just thinking about it, we have, and I'll come to Alistair Scott first, by the way, just to warn you. But before I do that, my final question is that I guess that we've got hundreds of UK higher education or academic research institutions, all kind of competing. So to what extent are universities or academic institutions addressing that competition, or to what extent are they enabling impact-focused careers? And what can we do as institutions differently?
Those are tough ones. I mean, the second part, to enable impact-focused careers, do you mean impact-oriented researchers, or do you mean impact professional slots, or neither or both?
Either, both, everything. I
think certainly having knowledge exchange professionals that are respected as parts of teams, so that is part of the institution needs to respect that, and for knowledge exchange professionals or researchers really focusing a lot on impact, institutions need to realize that takes time. I mean, there's a lot of relationship building, and there's a lot of effort. Stakeholders change, you have to start over again. I think there interdisciplinarity is another one of my loves, and it takes time to build an interdisciplinary team. It takes time to build these impact relationships. So universities really do need to give credit for that. So that's part of an answer. The competition answer, I think what CASCADE is doing is great. I think there are consortia that try to bring bring people together from across institutions in a particular area. And they might have different companies belong to them or different government units. So I don't know that I can readily, having worked with universities for a very long time, I don't know that I can readily imagine universities holding hands and saying, let's never compete again. We'll all try for the same impact. But I can imagine, and I've seen consortia, effectively like Cascade, where around a particular theme or issue or set of stakeholders, universities might collaborate. I don't know. What do you think, Kathryn?
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that other than I sometimes think that when collaborative projects like this happen, they happen despite universities rather than because of them, unfortunately. I do completely agree that it is the most useful way of working, much more useful for government to be able to go to a group which is interdisciplinary, involves people from multiple different organizations at multiple different career stages with different skills, than to have to set up 40 individual discussions with different universities. And it's also, for what it's worth, what government finds it really difficult to do for itself is to think in that cross-cutting way. They find that really hard. So I think it's the most useful thing the higher education sector can do is bring those things together and say, here's what we've learned about this big problem. Here's how it looks in different places.
Absolutely. That kind of integration that a portal can provide across disciplines and institutions. I mean, Scotland has experimented with several of those about water, about different topics. Again, it's sort of theme or issue based, but then that facilitates the sort of integration Kathryn was talking about and the visibility, as Cascade has, so that government or other stakeholders know where to go to get that integration.
So thank you very much. I'm going to invite Alistair to ask his question about cock-ups, and then Nibu, I'm going to come to you afterwards for your question. So Alistair, do you want to ask away?
Yeah, well, I could, but actually Kathryn later on has answered it. So in the spirit of actually progressing that answer, I thought, if you see in the chat further down, she's actually given a very good answer to the question, which was the fact that we tend to suppress cock-ups. As a professor myself in planning, I do a lot of knowledge exchange work, and I actually did a cock-up seminar as part of the dissemination of my mainstreaming nature project, which actually is on my website. So what I'm saying is actually available. But the biggest cock-up I made is where I was working with partners, and one in particular partner was really in the area that I was keen to push a particular line. So rather than engaging in knowledge exchange, I was actually trying to direct their agenda, and I got pushed back because I was trying to do it at my pace and not their pace. And I think one of the biggest problems sometimes is that academics tend to have particular deadlines or particular things like a ref or the ref impact, which is what I was actually responding to at the time. And as a result of that, I learned a very salutary lesson. And therefore now I kind of have rechanged how I approached the initial framing. So whilst Kathryn and Laura talked about maybe the goals being explicit at the outset, it's also making sure how you actually are going to work that knowledge exchange process and to defend when the institution is saying, why haven't you made more progress? And I just wondered that might be a way of actually just building on what Kathryn said. I think a lot more open forums where people with experience who seem to be great, I'm seen to be great in my own institutions. I give talks all the time, and they're quite shocked when I actually tell them I make bloody great big cock-ups. But who else is actually doing that? That maybe is the point. Thanks.
I don't know if either of you want to quickly respond to that, or shall we move on to Nibu?
I've got a very quick response, which is I think it's so important, especially for those of us in more senior positions where we have more freedom and autonomy to say that we've made cock-ups, that we actually do that, and that we say so to the funders. It's very difficult for more junior colleagues to say, oh, got that one wrong, if they feel like it's going to have a direct impact on their jobs. We need to model that and show the way, and also educate funders that things are not always going to go the way that they expected.
One thing I do with all my evaluations, before funders even ask for it, I always would add a section on lessons learned. And so I stimulate critical reflection by a team, because if you've gone through a complicated, ambitious program, you must have learned lessons. But I've been thanked by many people because they never had time to stop and critically reflect. But and it's not as brave as saying what your own mistakes have been or problems have been. But what I often do, if I ever evaluate something, any of you or you'll know about this, I'll ask for what lessons have you learned, and what kinds of problems or issues might you warn other people about, and that will often help me understand what the problems have been, and at the same time, particularly if a funder bothers to share the evaluations, it lets those lessons learned be shared.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Nibu, and after Nibu is James next.
I'd like to begin by thanking Kathryn for all the papers that she's written. It has been really nice reading them. In one particular paper, I shared the link in 2014. It lays out the assumptions that we make in this evidence policy interface field. And one of them is that all of this is relying on the fact that evidence will actually lead to a change in policy, which will lead to a better socioeconomic outcome or health outcome. Do we have some examples for those? Because that would be really helpful for us to make a case for more evidence into policy in all the grants that we write or in future research. Thanks.
This is the $1 million question, isn't it? And those of us who work in knowledge exchange take it as for granted that more evidence is a better thing. I don't think we have any really clear empirical evidence that, those of us from a health research background would accept as being robust. What we do have, so I've put a link in the chat, there is a systematic review out now that shows a dose response around the more engaged hospitals are in research, the better quality their practice is. So that's very exciting that we've shown that empirically. We don't have anything like that for policy, but that's partly because we don't have an agreement about what good policy looks like or what good policy outcomes look like. So increasingly what I tend to try and focus on is, can we get the process to look as good as we would like it to get? That's what we can observe, and really realistically, what we're saying is a really good evidence for policy system or science and policy system, or however you might think about it, that has got to serve any political flavor and deliver any political outcome which our democratic system is trying to move us towards. So what we can do is we can say, have they got access to the right kinds of information? Are they drawing on a diverse set of experts? Have we got accountability structures that let us have some transparency about what they're looking at, who they're talking to, and how they're using that information? Can we see how that information is influenced, if it's been used in the decision making or not? That's where I think we can be most helpful at the moment.
Thank you so much.
I'm really conscious James has had his hand up for ages.
James, do you want to go next?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Kathryn. I think that's been a really useful set of slides, and I really look forward to reviewing it again. And I've already flagged to a couple of colleagues that I think they ought to look at the recording of the meeting. So thank you both. I think I'm going to make a comment from a JNCC perspective, if I may, and sort of for those of you who maybe don't know me or don't know where I'm coming from, I'm sitting in perhaps one of those oval circles that was being described by Laura in terms of actually being part of that interface between academia and government, in terms of actually trying to make sure that science advice is being given into those policy processes. And I think one of the key things for that is actually about seeing the big picture, and it's about across many policies rather than just one. And it's one of the things we get perhaps when we're at one of these big international meetings. You've got various NGOs who've got particular focus that they want to see taken forward, but actually policy making and that advice that we need to give is actually much broader, and it's needing to understand a lot of these things are about joining dots and not about single issues. I really agree with the point about relationships, and that trust between individuals, building that trust over a long time is absolutely critical. I've had some very robust conversations with individuals in DEFRA, but only A, in private, and B, because I know them well. And that's important. And that continuity is really important. I think I've now dealt with 7 sets of policy officials linking with conventional migratory species. JNCC is part of that continuity, and it's actually a really important part of what we do. And then the final bit I want to pick up on is brevity, because you said it, I think, Kathryn, in terms of sort of what people are got time to read. I had a colleague who used to give me sort of stuff and say, I'm sorry this is so long, I didn't have time to make it shorter. Actually taking that time to make it shorter is part of what is going to make that knowledge exchange more effective, because it's going to be something that people can engage with rather than actually go over their heads. And then I'm just going to bring in one very, very final bit, which is I've been using the UK Research and Innovation internships, the policy internships, to be able to take forward pieces of work that I don't have time to do myself, but that I really want to get taken forward in terms of things that have been put as decisions on the CMS Scientific Council. And I think that that is a really good model in terms of how we can actually make really good interactions. And if I can make a plea, it's for being able to have more of that sort of interaction going on. And I think that is the sort of thing that Cascade is starting to work towards. I hope that's not too much of a diatribe.
Now, do either of you want to respond to that very briefly before we move to the wrap up?
I'm just always pleased to talk to somebody, one of those ovals. And there have been so many people that don't realize that they're knowledge intermediary until after I've interviewed them. I say, do you know what you are? They say, what? I said, you're a knowledge intermediary. It's an incredibly important function. And I think that relationship building is important. And the capacity building for those interns, just think of the ripple effects as they internalize learning how policy works, for example. It's great.
I just wanted to pick up on the robust conversations in private point, which I think is definitely how it works, but also a real challenge for evaluation. And, you know, I now run a policy research program, and we ask people to account for their impact in annual reports and things. And I get lists of, we had these meetings with this email exchange, and just think, I don't need to know that. Like, what I need to know is, do you think it's part of your job to develop trusted relationships, and are you doing it? You tell me that you're doing it, I believe you. So for me, it's about how do we get this? So it's like a sense of integrity, and it comes back to your other point about I'm taking the time to make this short. I see that as my job to do that. You know, it's my responsibility, and not just creating work for other people. So there's something for me about almost a code of practice and what good practice looks like if you're trying to do this professionally as part of an academic role.
Excellent. I can't remember who the author was who said, I'm sorry for writing such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one. But my final question to you is just to wrap up. So if there was one key takeaway from each of you from today's webinar, what that you'd like everyone to remember, what would that be?
I suppose that to always think about different types of impacts as developing through processes over time, keeping an eye on those processes, learning from them as you go, critically reflect as you go, so that you can capture not only important impacts, but also insights that you can share with others.
Excellent. Kathryn?
For me, it's this question of morality behind what we do. Impact is not about trying to further our careers or demonstrate how wonderful we've been, or even just increase the volume of our voice in policy spaces. It's about trying to do the right thing. And that's hard, and we need to help each other work out what that looks like in practice.
Thank you very much. And before I close with Anna, so thank you, both of you, for your talks, and also for engaging on the chat. There's lots of links and questions and resources and papers and all sorts of wonderful stuff to follow up there for the audience. But thank you very much, both. That was brilliant. Hannah, do you want to tell everyone about our other equally fascinating and wonderful seminars that are coming?
Yes, I will do. And yeah, the chat has been really interesting, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. So we will take a record of that. And if there are any questions that we've missed, if it's okay with Laura and Kathryn, we can send you responses to those after this. So just finally to close, let me share my screen. Okay. hopefully you can all see. So we are powering through our first webinar series. We have 2 more remaining. They'll be every 2 weeks in this same slot. So the next one coming up is slight gear change from this one. Instead, we're focusing on big questions in spatial planning. So we'll be joined by Bob Smith, who is director of DICE, the Durrell Institute for Conservation and Ecology at the University of Kent, and some of his colleagues, Tom Pienkowski and Sam Azelwood, to think about big questions in spatial planning. So if you're interested in that or know people who might be, do come along. And then finally, we'll close this webinar series with a broader session thinking about the future of policy relevant research in the UK. So that will be with some members of the CASCADE team, as well as Sarah Chater, who is research and strategy lead at UCL and also co-chair of CAPE. So do sign up via the QR code or the website if you would like to join. And then finally, once again, thank you so much for joining today. We would love to keep in touch if you're not yet part of Cascade and would like to be. You can find us via all these links. You can email me and we will share the recording of this afterwards if you want to share it with colleagues to catch up on this session. So thank you so much again, Laura and Kathryn. It was fantastic hearing from you, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Great discussion. Thanks for great questions.